Welcome to our Diwan session. Today we are going to talk about mental health in Muslim youth community with Yaqeen Sikander. Thank you for being us, Yaqeen.
Thank you, you're welcome.
And I'm Zehra. Yaqeen Sikander is internationally recognized for his amazing ability to bring principles of psychology, spirituality, philosophy, and research into practical strategies that accelerate performance, success, and empowerment. And as a psychotherapist and a wellness consultant, he trains and coaches leaders. As a psychotherapist, Mr. Yaqeen trained in Malaysia, Germany, Turkey, and India to develop people-centric interventions that boost individual and organizational success and well-being. Yaqeen is an excellent storyteller and also a polyglot. He is published author and poet, who also actively participated in non-profit peace building and conflict resolution. Yaqeen is currently a research scholar completing in his PhD in clinical psychology at Ibn Haldun University in Istanbul. Today, he will divine session for different parts. In introduction parts, he will talk about significance of addressing mental health in Muslim youth within the Sharq region. First of all, he will define mental health and address common misconceptions related to mental health within the Muslim community. He will discuss the importance of promoting positive mental health and Muslim youth. Then, in the second part, he will explore the influence of cultural and religious factors on mental health perceptions within the Sharq region. Finally, he will recognize mental health challenges.
So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very beautiful to see all of you present here. Thank you so much for coming. I apologize for being late. You know, in therapy, as a therapist, we always talk about, especially after the COVID-19, that how we should embrace the uncertainty of life, right? But having said that, today I realized, even though I do advise others, including myself, to have this sort of uncertainty, because we don't know how events are going to turn out in life. So today, this uncertainty came to me and my wife because we live 10 minutes far from here, right? But from the last 1.5 hours, we couldn't find any taxi, anything. So last 2 kilometers, we have to come walking, in case you're wondering why I'm sweating like this. So the last 2 kilometers, me and my wife, we literally had a good, sports time until we reached here. Sometimes, circumstances happen the way they do. Point being, really sorry for, being late. This is not an excuse. This is just how sometimes, life corners you in certain circumstances, which are really difficult for you to overcome. Like, you have no power over them. And I'm really thankful to Sharq Youth Forum for inviting me in this Diwan talk session. And it's especially happening in the city of Istanbul, which is literally the center of the world, where the Europe ends and the Asia starts. Napoleon said this. He said, if world was one country, Istanbul would be its capital. So having this session in this city with the Sharq Forum is an absolute pleasure. So coming to the topic that we're going to talk about today, let me talk a little bit about that. We're talking about rewriting the narrative. We are talking about fostering positive mental health among the young people and among the youth in the Sharq region. Now, what is my approach to the topic? As I was preparing this talk, it looked very straightforward to me. But then I realized the more I was trying to talk and define what I'm going to talk to you about today, I realize how broad and complex this whole issue is, especially when it comes to the Sharq region. There are so many layers to this topic, and all of these layers are intertwined with each other, and it wouldn't be doing justice if I don't talk about mental health today from a more holistic perspective. Because mental health does not occur in vacuum. Mental health has socio-cultural, political, economic reasons in which it grows, develops, and in which it's sustained. Now, having said that, all these factors affect us, who we are, how we form our personalities. But sometimes what ends up happening is we are only addressing the symptoms, or it's like we're addressing the branches without addressing where the root problem is. And that's why this topic about fostering mental health and rewriting this narrative, I'm going to approach it in the same way Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he approached Greek logic in his book, Kitab al-Rad al-Mantaqiyin. So Greek logic is a lot, and he was very smart. So rather than taking arguments one by one, this is a Greek argument and this would be its refutation, it's really hard to do that. There would be so many arguments. So he goes right to the roots and starts, for example, from the idea of the definition. What is a definition? What is the philosophical approach to definitions, and why we don't agree with them? So it was very smart to just look at it from a bigger approach and to refute it like that, right? So taking that as a starting point and inspiration as well. So I'll be discussing mental health in terms of themes rather than individual stances. Like how do you, for instance, foster mental health? So rather than looking at, you should take care of your physical health or you should do this and that, let's talk about more, especially when it comes to Sharq region where the problems come from. So this is more of a macro, from a macro level, we'll be approaching this topic. And now when I use the term Sharq region, or when we talk about the region of the Sharq, I will use it, as synonymously with the Muslim world. So when we talk about Sharq, I will use it in terms of the whole Muslim world that we are talking about, and what are some of the challenges that we find in mental health of the Muslims. Now, one of the questions that can be asked is, why this topic? What is the significance of it? Why is it essential? I mean, of course, because my background is that of a therapist, and it is that of a Muslim who spent most of his adult life studying the Muslim world, psychology of, the science of psychology, as well as living and thriving in the Muslim world. Now, I'll take you back to my days when I did my bachelor's in Malaysia. Why this is significant. We had this subject, it was called experimental psychology. Those of you who have psychology background would know that. And we had to perform an experiment to pass the course during our bachelor's day. So we came across an experiment, it was a group experiment. We told the students that we are making some pills which are actually approved. So you take those pills, you'll perform better in your examination. Okay, so we had a lot of participants, bachelor's, master's students coming to us and telling us, we need the pills, we can perform better in exams. And this is right before the examination, maybe a month or a couple of months before the examination. And we gave them the pills. And they started taking the pills every day, each day a single pill. And they take these pills. And guess what? They passed the exams and all of them came back saying that their GPA really increased. They need more of these pills, right? But what was actually in those pills? They were sugar pills. It was nothing other than plain sugar. Literally, plain sugar, you just put it, compress it, it forms like a tablet and you just give it to them. So that is placebo effect, right? And this is the autonomy of the brain, the mind over the body. So this topic is really interesting because our mental health defines a lot of the things that we do in life. And the life that we live, the modern life that we are living nowadays, we have a declining mental health and well-being because of the challenges of modernity. So we have problems when it comes to identity, especially when we talk about the Muslim world. So these are turbulent times. I mean, we live in a time literally where stupidity is weaponized. We are living in a world where we exactly don't know what a woman is. Literally, like this is a huge debate, what is a woman? For thousands of years now, nobody questioned what a woman is, but now we really have to come up and, define what really a woman means or what really a man means. So this is a time when stupidity is weaponized. So we need to balance and explore our worldview. So three main aspects of today's topic we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the narrative because we're talking about rewriting a narrative. Before you rewrite a narrative, let's talk about what a narrative is and what is the narrative of mental health in the Muslim world. And why do we rewrite it? And how do we do that exactly? And then we come to the point of how can we foster positive mental health when it comes to youth of Sharq. And this is essential because in order to reach the idea of fostering mental health, doing something positive, we have to realize what's actually stopping us from doing that. Interestingly, Rumi said this. He says that your task is not to seek love. but it's actually remove the barriers which you have made towards love. So when people say like, how to be successful, the idea would be how do I have a good mental health? Let's question ourselves what's stopping us from being successful. What is the barrier between me and my good mental health? So that's why it's really essential to know what is the narrative and how do we rewrite that narrative, which will bring us to how do we foster positive mental health, especially in the Muslim world. Now, when we talk about mental health in the Muslim world, it's a very binary classification. And what does that mean? Either, I'm from Kashmir, I'm from the Indian part of Kashmir. So either somebody is sane or somebody is insane. It's very binary. We don't have things in between. Either a person is normal or a person is abnormal. So it's only these two classifications. So you're normal, you're healthy, or you're crazy. So nothing in between. While as mental health is a spectrum. Mental health and craziness sometimes can be two very different things, and we don't even use those terms in therapy. But we do see them used in commonplace whenever I go back home, whenever we do programs there. So this idea of, or when we studied in Malaysia, I had students from over 120 countries. And when we would discuss with them, most of them were from the Muslim world, it would be the same idea, right? Very binary classification, which means there is lack of understanding when it comes to mental health. And what does that mean? Because when you don't know the cause of something, you will attribute it to something you're more certain about. That's why in the Muslim world, if somebody has mental health condition, it's immediately translated as lack of faith, right? So when you say, I might be depressed or anxiety, no, you don't pray, or you're not doing this, and this activity, or you're not reading enough of the Quran, or you're not having enough of the Iman, which is why you're exactly in the situation that you're in. That is because of the lack of awareness. And with this narrative, we need to question where the foundations are coming from. And is this really a religious stance? Is this really an Islamic stance? And if we look at the religious stance of the narrative of when it comes to mental health, it is absolutely normal. And Islam and our tradition very much normalized it, that feeling down. Prophet ﷺ, he went through a whole year of huzn, which is called as Amal Huzn, where his wife and his uncle passed away. So he was sad. And there is nothing wrong in terms of showing our emotions. And I would always argue this. Religion is primarily emotional in its nature, which is why emotion-focused therapy works better with people who believe in a religion like Islam. And why is that? For instance, love of Allah, love of paradise, fear of Allah, trusting Allah, which is tawakkul, love, fear, trust. All of those are primary emotions when you study emotion-focused therapy. So Allah says, love me the most because He created us and we owe it to Him. Or we love our tradition. Or we are afraid not to do the major sins, for example. Or we trust Allah because we don't have all the answers to things. And the answers we don't find. We have the concept of tawakkul. So all of those are actually derived from emotions. But on the other hand, when we look at the reality of the Muslim world and the narrative, it's extremely stigmatized. How many of us would actually be very open to talk about our mental health with our families? Or in Kashmir, for example, one of the things people really hide is their mental health conditions. And I do understand why they do that. I know mothers who hide the problems of their children, or young women who are not married, because if it's known that they are taking antidepressants or they are seeing a therapist, it's immediately considered a no-no when it comes to finding, let's say, a marriage partner. So the stigma runs deep in the Muslim world. And another thing here is this idea that psychology is something which makes miserable people less miserable. No, it's not that. The idea of psychotherapy is not only to help the people who are miserable, to make them less miserable. It's actually to promote well-being. So think of it like this. If we have a number line, mine's 20, 30, 50 to plus, whatever it is. Psychology is thought to be something which people who are in the minds of the number line, which brings them back to the zero. But it's not only about that. It's also about how do you go from that zero further into the positive, towards your well-being. How do you thrive? So life and psychology and therapy is not just about surviving, it's about thriving. But when we have a narrative like this, in which Muslim mental health or the mental health of Muslims, and I have seen a lot of men in our part of the world suffering as well. Because for men, being a man as well, it's very difficult to talk about your mental health. It's really hard to reach out. Why? Because like we talked about how mental health is equated with the lack of faith, in terms of men, it's equated with weakness. You're weak, how can you be depressed? That's why you have people like Andrew Tate who say that there is nothing like depression. Your therapist does coke every weekend if you have heard to his talk. So why does he say things like that? And why is that narrative that popular? And we're going to talk about that as well, so just hit my mind. So now when we talk about such a narrative in which people don't have proper awareness of mental health in the Muslim world, in which the stigma runs deep in our society that you cannot come up and you don't have enough of the safe spaces in which you can come up and talk about your problems without having the fear of being judged. The biggest idea why people don't come out, talk about their mental health, in Western or even in the Muslim world, is the stigma and the fear of judgment. Because this fear of judgment, if I tell my employer or if the people at the workplace know that I have a mental health condition, where am I going to end up? They're going to gossip, they're going to talk about me, I'm never going to get promoted. So it really runs deep. So this stigma needs to be addressed in general, but I have found to a lot of extent, it goes much deeper in the Muslim world, or when we are talking about the Sharq. So these are some of the, in the brief time, that some of the things that we can cover about the narrative. And this can give us an idea of why we need a different narrative and how can we achieve that. You see, it goes without saying, if you ask me, everything psychological at some level is political as well, because mental health does not occur in vacuum. In Kashmir, we lived under conflict. It does affect you. If you have seen war, if you have been a refugee, most of the refugees are Muslims. If you have suffered, if you have seen your family suffer, if you have seen the Muslim world suffer as an ummah, it will affect you one way or the other. It definitely will. And do we have a voice that speaks for us, that talks about our narrative? And there were attempts, right? Talk about 70s. We have this concept of Islamization of knowledge. I studied in the International Islamic University, Malaysia, and we always talked about, the Islamic worldview, Islamic psychology. We took courses in that. But there is something which was lacking, in my opinion, and which is this, that you are having a Western textbook, right? And you use this as a curriculum, right? And in the end, you quote a couple of verses from the Quran and suddenly it becomes Islamic. And that approach is very problematic. And the dichotomy, right, which I saw there, I felt it's not really serving the purpose that Muslims should be looking forward to. Because if we are looking forward to an Islamic psychology, it has to start from the epistemology, it has to start from ontology, it has to start from bottom up, rather than importing all the Western curriculums, reading a couple of Quranic verses on top of this, and suddenly it becomes Islamic. And that was something, even though attempt was there, we had a lot of genius intellectuals moving from the Western part of the world, teaching there in Malaysia. But ultimately, the project did not succeed as it was supposed to. Reason being, it was still addressing the branches while not addressing the root, as I said in the start of the talk. Now, we do have an alternate model, which is traditional, Islamically oriented psychotherapy, which is TIAP, which is known as. It is something that you might look into, which is a better model than directly what I studied in Malaysia, which was just the Islamization of knowledge. And the narrative we are talking about, why it needs to change in the Muslim world when it comes to mental health, is for the very same reason that I just said. We think that we are creating a discourse, which is an Islamic discourse based on the model which was there in Malaysia, but it's not the truth. What we were actually doing is there is already a discourse. What you're doing is you're already contributing to the already existing discourse. So it's not that you are creating something of your own, but you're contributing to something which is already there. So I do find that is something that really needs to change. And we do have to start right from our own foundations. And when we talk about mental health in the Muslim world, we do have a lot of challenges, and a lot of the things and disparity is very systemic, which means this. In the Muslim world, mental health is not emphasized as it should be. Yeah, there can be some exceptions. You can give some good examples of countries like UAE, how it's happening there. Turkey is changing a lot of the things, but I'm saying things in general, based on the stigma, based on the funding that we need, based on the institutions that we need. They don't exist. And we need to start this conversation when we start talking about it, right? And if, as young people, we start thinking like, how can we make a difference? How do we change this, right? So we literally need to look at how we define human nature. And one of the biggest things in psychology is, in the modern psychology, it wouldn't, agree to the concept of the soul, which creates its own problems, right? So then they will, in order to overcome that problem, which is an existential problem, they will come up with the idea of transcendental psychology. Like, you can feel spiritual without the idea of God or without the idea of soul in a very secular manner. So there is a branch of APA which deals with transcendental psychology, that how spirituality and believing in something bigger than yourself can give you meaning. But they wouldn't accept it's Allah or it's God, and they wouldn't accept that human beings have a soul. It's because of that we have spiritual needs as well. So it would be very much secularized in that sense. So that is something that we need to start. Like, how do we, in the Islamic perspective, from a Muslim worldview, look at human nature? What is our epistemology and ontology? How do we define what soul is? How about the debate of nature versus nurture? How many of the traits are actually inherited, and how much is the environmental effect? Who are we as human beings? What are we doing in this world? Existential question. And what is my relation, to the universe which is out there? And these are big questions, and they need answers. And we are out there as curious human beings to address these issues. And talking a little bit more about this narrative and writing down this narrative and overcoming, and this is somewhere when I said this is very complex and it's intertwined with a lot of other factors. And when we talk about those factors, it will actually clarify a little bit more that where I'm trying to reach with this. So if we talk about having our own worldview, rewriting this narrative which is existing because of the stigma in the Muslim world, or because of the wholesale import of Western models of psychology and trying to apply them on people like Muslims. I mean, think about it. If you see a Muslim who's praying 5 times a day, if you see it in a very scientific, modern, Western psychological way, it's actually obsessive compulsive disorder, right? You have an obsession to pray 5 times. Why 5? Why not 7 or 8? 5. And it has to be at the specific time. There are both obsessions and compulsions in it, right? Think about that. Right? So if you totally look at it from a Western perspective, it is actually OCD. So if you go to a person who is Western trained, has no idea about Islam, tell him, I do this. Don't call it Islamic prayer. Tell him, I have specific times when I wake up. I pray this, and this time. And it has to be a specific time or I will feel uncomfortable about it. It's a clear OCD diagnosis that you'll end up with. But is that the truth? No, it's not. Why? Because we need people who understand our worldview and where it is coming from. So this importing of the models and trying to call them Islamic somehow, I don't think it's going to cut it. We have to start, and we have to believe in, what we are trying to put out there. And that's why there are challenges, right? So talking about what are the challenges when it comes to fostering the mental health and how we can foster, the mental health. So when I was talking about it, I thought about Goethe, who's a, philosopher. His idea of happiness was very interesting. How do modern people understand happiness? For us, happiness is gaining more and more pleasure and avoidance of pain. I mean, more hedonistic pleasure, get a new phone, have good food, live in a good place, get a good car. This is happiness, right? But how was happiness understood classically by the Greeks or by the Muslims? Or Goethe, that I was recently reading, he talks about happiness as overcoming some tasks. Like you have a goal in life, you reach it, you overcome it, then there will be a new goal. So this is happiness, overcoming challenges. So if we are talking about fostering positive mental health among the Muslim youth, we have to talk about challenges. And when we overcome these challenges, be it intellectual challenges or actual challenges on the ground, we will find the happiness and we will find positive mental health if we remove these barriers or contribute towards this discourse that we are talking about. So what are the challenges that we do have? Number one, it would actually be developing our worldview that I a little bit talked about. But not only that, it's also about not being apologetic about who we are and what we believe in. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. Why are we apologetic? Why are we the way we are? And it has a lot to do with colonial legacy. It has a lot to do with how Muslims are at the receiving end of the discourse. So what we are actually trying to do is we are trying to take the Western models, or we're trying to take that worldview as our standard and somehow trying to reach that. So I think that inferiority complex, intellectual inferiority, which was left as as a colonial residue in our places because of colonialism, a lot of Muslim places were colonized, for instance. So the residue is still there. So we need to stand firm in what we believe in. And we have to realize a lot of the problems we talk of the modern world, they're actually philosophical problems. And when they are philosophical problems, they need intellectual responses. And we might think, like, in the Western worldview, other people have it better than us. That's not true. We think that because we have lost in touch with our own history and identity. And that is a very sad place to be in. Why are we trying, you will see a different type of modernity when I go back to Kashmir, right, which is supposed to be a Muslim conservative place. We try to overcompensate. You wouldn't see Western people as much Western as you will see a lot of the Muslims who are trying to. And you can see this very much in this country, right? In the English you say more loyal than the king. And where is that coming from? That is coming from the idea that you feel inadequate, or you feel that the worldview that you believe in as a Muslim, that might not be enough. And that disconnects you from your identity, that disconnects you from your history. And some way, one way or the other, we are disconnected. Why are we so attracted to Western psychology, for example? We don't know the contribution of the Muslim scholars in psychology. Or we haven't looked at Islamic text from a psychological perspective. Readings are very different. I was very young, 12, 13, I started reading religion, right? In traditionally how you study religion. It's a very different view when I read the same books after I became a therapist, because you have a different mindset then, right? And I started finding a lot of things which are very beneficial in the therapeutic practice after I became a therapist. And why is that? Because you're looking from a different perspective. So maybe we haven't looked at our text the way that we should be looking. And it should be with sincerity, with contributing something to the world, rather than seeking acceptance and validation from the other side. And I'll give an example of this, which is extremely common. Because language, if we have something as therapists, it's the words. Because we believe in therapy, words are what makes the difference, and why language plays such a crucial role. And this idea that you have to accept people with whatever identity they have. It's a part of, you have to be, if you talk about LGBT issues, it's one of the core issues. It's a hot issue. Talk about how LGBT, without there are more than 70 genders, which they themselves wouldn't remember, people who believe in that, but I'm supposed to remember all of those and ask people what their pronouns are, for instance. But what ends up happening is if you say things like, no, I don't know, or maybe I believe there are only two genders. You have to be more open-minded about it, right? Then you start thinking, am I not being open-minded enough, or I'm not open-minded? Okay, that might be the problem. But what we have to actually question is, do we need to be open-minded? I will always say, we actually need to be filtered-minded. Open mind, garbage in, garbage out. How do I know something is therapy or not? Because I filter it. This intervention, is it evidence-based? My filter says evidence-based, yes, therapy. No, not evidence-based, not therapy. We always need to have filters. You see how, when we feel something is lacking, we try to grab on, open-minded, I have to be open-minded. That means acceptance of everything which is out there. No, it doesn't. We have to have filters in our mind. To know reality, you need to have filters. To have knowledge, to distinguish between right and wrong, you need to have filters. So you see what ends up happening when we are trying to seek the validation rather than believing in what is the worldview that I come from. And in terms of psychology as well in therapy, we have a personality test, which is most valid evidence-based personality test. Anybody knows what it's called?
Big Five?
exactly, is the Big Five personality test, right? Big Five has most studies over it. It talks about 5 factors. It talks about openness, extroversion, conscientiousness. It talks about agreeableness and neuroticism, right? Look at the first factor, openness. It doesn't say open-mindedness, right? So even if we look at it in those terms, how these terms are thrown at us, and somehow we have to comply with them. Not necessarily. And another thing when we are talking about the challenge, it's also the idea that because we're talking about this being an intellectual challenge, and then who speaks for Islam? It's a very interesting idea. When we talk about our Prophet ﷺ, right? Because we live in this age where we have a lot of influencers. Our Prophet's method was not to influence, it was to inspire. In no way his way was to, I have to influence other people. It was to inspire. They felt inspired and they did whatever they did without any coercion, right? Without being forced, which has been a dilemma from a very long time, even in the classic scholars, that if we have an Islamic government, which things are you actually going to impose by force? Because Prophet never had to force people. He said, leave alcohol, they just left it. He never went around people with force, and they just believed in him, right? And why did they do that? Because they were inspired by him. They were really inspired by him. He was an excellent role model. But when we look at our young people today, especially when we look at young men, we have to ask this question when we especially talk about religion of Islam, who speaks for Islam? And now you have people like Andrew Tate, who's a Muslim now, and talking about this idea of who the alpha men are, when you read the evidence, there is nothing like somebody being an alpha male. It was a concept, and you can see the person who developed this concept, his interview, you can check it out online. He somehow regrets it, but his idea of alpha was how he did research among the wolves. It was never meant for human beings. And alpha in the wolves is the person who is responsible for the pack. And he's not necessarily the most charismatic, most eloquent of the whole pack. It's more about the responsibility. But when people apply it, and now it's very interesting. I see a lot of people online especially, hi, I'm an alpha Muslim, so I don't do this, and this. Or now, because alpha became more of a cliche now, you will have a new trend of what are sigma people, right? You have a lot of, sigmas do this, alphas do this. It's not applied on human beings, it's an animal theory. It doesn't apply. And it has no evidence whatsoever. In therapy, for instance, you will never read such things of who is an alpha male and who's not. So such concepts, why are they there? Why do we have role models who promote something like that? Because we need to have role models and we need to have people who are up to the intellectual mark and who are up to the mark of studying our tradition and our worldview and then talking about it. You see, interestingly, after the Holocaust, for instance, if you talk about Department of Jewish Studies, in any university, any Western university, wherever Department of Jewish Studies is, all of those people who teach Jewish studies are Jews. They are. You can check it out in any universities, right? What about Department of Islamic Studies in the Western universities? How much of the faculty you'll actually find who are Muslims? Do some research. You'll be astonished. In most of the Western universities, Islamic studies is actually taught by non-Muslims. It's not taught by Muslims. Now, there are different reasons for that. But one of the reasons is, are we up to the task if we are talking about the narrative? And do we have people who can speak for Islam, who can speak for our narrative and creating that narrative? And once we have that there, another reason how we foster this positive mental health that we are talking about is that we need to address this collective trauma which Muslim world has been through. Because we have to understand, often people come up with these arguments. Look at all the modern inventions. It was all Western people. We are Muslims. We are asleep. We are not doing anything. That's why we go to the Western world. They have everything because we have this, and this problem. It's a very simplistic view of looking at things. But if you do a historical analysis, we carry a collective trauma. Colonialism. We have the problems happening in Palestine. We have the problems with Muslim world all over, how we are oppressed, how Muslims are represented in the media, right? And how we are on the receiving end of every single thing. And the colonial legacy, which is there. What colonialism did to the Muslim world. We have to take those factors into consideration as well when we talk about mental health of the Muslims. You cannot isolate it from the intergenerational trauma. And that is somewhere connected to our faith as well. Because our Prophet ﷺ, he said that there is, this ummah is like a single body. If one part of the body pains, you feel the pain in all of your body. And if a Muslim is suffering somewhere, or a group of Muslims in Palestine are suffering, and you don't feel any pain in your body or in yourself, that means somehow or somewhere there is a problem with your faith. Because a core sign of faith is feeling this empathy for other people. So we have this trauma, which is collective, which is not being redressed, where we don't find closure for how many, recently there was the Bosnian genocide that happened, right? And we have the issue of Palestine is ongoing. What is happening in Kashmir, what is happening to the Uyghur Muslims. And these are issues, this is collective trauma which the Muslims are carrying on from a very long time. And this does affect our mental health. This does affect our productivity and what we bring on the table. It really does. And we also have to acknowledge that. We cannot just wholesale compare ourselves with the other people and how they have it, or how the Western world has it better, or they're progressing more. We have to see our roots and our history, where we are actually coming from. So addressing this collective trauma, we need therapists and we need mental health practitioners who actually know our history and tradition and where it's all coming from, who are informed enough when it comes to Muslim world. So that doesn't mean a therapist who just has a Muslim name. It actually means a person who actually knows what people have been through, who knows the history of people and what it took for certain people to leave their lands, to move somewhere else, what it means to be a refugee, what it means to see war, what it means to see conflict, and what it does to you. That intergenerational trauma. And how is intergenerational trauma passed? Is the stories which our parents tell us, our grandparents tell us. In Kashmir, we heard the stories. In Palestine, you'll hear the stories of survival, of resilience, of strength. But it does affect us, and it is transmitted, it is carried on. So this collective trauma that we have, we need mental health practitioners who are informed. You have this trauma-informed care, if you know the narrative of the modern psychology. We also need Muslim-informed care. Why is there something which does not acknowledge our sensitivity? In the Western world, you'll easily find it. I'm LGBTQ-informed therapist. You have indigenous people, specifically people working with them, and they are trained in the Western world. But we are like a huge chunk of the world's population. So why isn't there a discourse when we are talking about addressing this trauma? There is a trauma which we have, so why hasn't it been addressed in the modern psychology so far? So there need to be attempts from our side and from the other side as well, that we need people and we need therapists and mental health practitioners who are very well informed in our tradition. All right? Now, the other challenge that all of us must have faced one way or the other when it comes to the Muslim world, which is something very difficult, especially when you look at it intellectually, which is disunity, which is we find it very difficult sometimes to accept others, even though they may be Muslims, but just because their views are different than ours, it becomes problematic, not because only when you say, I'm a Muslim and my position is right, but my very position, which I believe within my religion, is the only right position and everybody else is wrong. I think Muslims, over the time, we have also suffered because of a perpetual disunity among our world, especially when we talk in terms of, in intellectual terms. Because ultimately the idea of ihsan, right? If you're only good to the people who are good to you, then you should question your goodness, right? Being good means also being good to people who are not good to you. And that is ultimately taking the higher ground. And I have seen this issue from a very long time, from more than a decade, in which there are Muslims who would like to contribute to the Muslim world, right? But they feel very much alienated. I was talking to one of these persons, he worked in Hollywood. We did a program together 10 years back. He said, I was in this club and I was talking to this lady, and this lady had to get a drink at the bar, right? And she said, what do you want to drink? I said, I don't drink. Why? Because I'm a Muslim. The lady goes like, I'm a Muslim as well. He says the bartender is listening to us. He takes something out. He says, I'm a Muslim as well. He has a thing written here. Oh, so he's like, I'm in between these two people. Both of them are Muslims. I'm a Muslim, but I don't drink. One is a bartender, other one is drinking. So what do I do? So then we were talking about the challenges which a lot of Muslims have to go through because of their work, because they feel they are not good enough. But what is the idea, right? We have alienated our own good people who can intellectually contribute a lot. Why? Because we call them apostates. We call them they are not good Muslims, or because they belong to a different sect. And because they are alienated, they don't feel they belong in the ummah. So all their contributions are actually Western contributions, because Islam is a religion with very broad principles, but we have just reduced it to a cult mentality, because of which we cannot contain people who have different ideas than us. And there is a solution for that, right? There is a basic principle in fiqh. When I was studying this with my sheikh, he said, a basic principle if you have to make wudu, if you're camping or you're in jungle or you're somewhere, you find water. How do you know this water is clean or not? If it's najis or clean? He said, if the water is big enough, right? Which means this, you put a stick in the water, try to move it. If these ripples reach the other side, water is too small, it can be dirty, it's risky. But if the water body is big, you're trying to move it with the stick, the water doesn't reach the other side, it's very huge. Even if some najasa or something dirty goes into it, you can still make wudu with it, it's considered pure. I said, okay, that's very good. And Ibn al-Qayyim said something, he was pointing to this very principle of Islam. He said, scholars are like people of knowledge, right? It doesn't only mean Islamic scholars, people of knowledge. They're like reservoirs of water, big reservoirs, they're like big tanks. Even if something dirty falls in it, it doesn't make the whole water najis. What does it mean? The idea is, even if there are people that you disagree with, it doesn't mean they're all wrong. Nobody can be perfect. But the question is, rather than looking at this small pot of dirt, right? Like we said, big capacity means water is pure. Rather than looking at the mistakes of others, why don't we increase our capacity for good? Right? If my capacity is only as much as this cup, something dirty falls in it, the whole water is dirty. But if my capacity is that of a room, and then the same dirt falls in it, it's no longer dirty, based on Islamic principles. What does that mean? Rather than looking at bad and what others are doing, increase your capacity for good. When you have a lot of capacity for good, even if there is something wrong in it, there is still khair in it. And that is something we need to acknowledge. Increase the capacity of good and join the hearts of other people. It is really, really essential, okay? So the last part, I know that it's already been 45 minutes, so can I have, no? We have to cut it here?
4 minutes.
Huh?
4 minutes left.
It's done? No, it's fine. Okay, if I can continue, it's okay. If it's not, it's not. Because lastly, what I wanted to discuss after this is the idea of how do we foster a positive mental health, right? Coming exactly to the topic after the challenges. The idea, first of all, would be that sense of community. We need safe spaces, we need organization. Just like what Sharq is trying to do. We are all here because they organized a program. We need to create spaces, and we have to acknowledge the fact we as Muslims, we are collectivists. Our worldview and our sense of self. Western sense of self, because sense of self is very important in psychology, right? You start with the self. As Muslims and as people who are Eastern rather than who believe in a Western worldview, our sense of self is not individualistic, it's collective, it's connected to others. Which is why we always think about, right, if I take this decision in career, is it gonna be okay for my family as well, right? We think about these things, right? We do think about family in different, it's not like Western people don't miss their children and stuff. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is in our part of the world, it affects us deeper because our sense of self is connected to the whole community. We're communal people. We are collectivists, right? So what does that mean? It means that, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that the upper hand is better than the lower. Contribution to the community, right? And the biggest contribution is being who you are. Contributing, being the best version of yourself is the biggest contribution you can do towards others. And that's why we need to think more like a community rather than just as an individual level, because modern world does try to make us very individualistic. So think of the community. And the second part would be about having self-compassion, right? Self-compassion means if you need help with mental health, There is nothing wrong in seeking therapy. Nothing wrong, right? There is this Quranic verse, it's very beautiful. It says that they forgot Allah and Allah made them forget themselves, right? They forgot Allah and Allah made them forget themselves. But look at the reverse meaning of it, corollary meanings. It's this: if you forget yourself, which means you're far from Allah, right? They forgot Allah, Allah made them forget themselves, which means when you're in the state of self-forgetfulness, you're far from Allah and His deen. So in order to be closer to Him, what does it mean? Taking care of yourself. So if you need help when it comes to mental health, it's best to explore that and to seek help whenever it's needed. It's a part of knowing yourself, and you owe that much to yourself. And in the end, just to conclude, the world we live in is extremely complex. Extremely complex in the sense that there is a slush of information. You open any social media, you get a million different ideas what people are trying to talk about. And then you don't know, what should I really believe in? There is this term, it's called doom scrolling. Ever heard of it? You just keep scrolling. It's called doom scrolling. It can go over and over without, any end. So simplifying things. Simplicity is beautiful. Simplicity never goes out of fashion. Making things simple. And rather than getting into, because, we talked many of the things which are, there are many intellectual principles there. But at the same time, sometimes, rather than getting into every single debate and whatever is happening out there, simplicity can also help in because we have made our lives very complex. Because we live in a world where we are always under scrutiny, because we're always online. Somebody shared their breakfast, somebody shared what they're doing at night, somebody is taking pictures with cars in Dubai, and we start feeling like, we have to be up to that standard. Or we have to do these great things simplify things, simplify your life. It's very easy to do that. And just to tell you a story to conclude, Imam Razi, he was a great scholar and a philosopher. He was just walking through this street, and people were flocking him, he's a known scholar. And there was this old lady, right? And this old lady said, why is these people following him? Who's this guy? The guy's you don't know who he is? He said, no, I don't know. Imam Razi. And he said, what is so special about him? He said, he wrote 40 arguments that God exists. He wrote a book he's a treatise, 40 arguments that God exists. And she's does he have so many doubts about Allah that he needs 40 reasons to write that he actually exists, right? And she said that she was, if you have ever seen a manual cotton loom, you put cotton on one side, it makes a thread on the other side. She said, I'm doing this here right while I'm sitting this, and this tells me that God exists and God is one. How so? See, there is an input. You put the cotton here and the thread is out. So there is Allah who created the universe. And there are no two gods, He's only one. How is that? Because I move it clockwise and then only I have thread. If there were two gods, one would be clockwise and other would be anti-clockwise, there would be no thread, which means there would be no universe, there would be chaos. She's my manual loom that I'm making the thread here, it's enough for me to know that God exists and there is only one God. And somehow this story reached Imam Razi, right? And when he was on his deathbed, right? So the shaitan comes to him, gives him all the intellectual arguments that deny Allah, right? Because he's very intellectual, he has studied Greek philosophy, he has done all these things, and he's having all these arguments on his deathbed. Then he says, it's written in the tradition, he said, you know what? I die on the same iman of that old lady of Nisapur who believed that in that simplicity. I die on her iman. Which is meaning to say that, all intellectuality, philosophy, it's all very beautiful. But at the same time, simplicity is amazing, and we need to take care of what is inside of us. Prophet ﷺ said, it's in the Sahih Bukhari, yes, it's there. He said that there is a piece of meat in your body, right? If that is okay, the rest of the body is all right, and that is the heart. And what is meant by here is not just the physical heart, it's also the metaphorical heart. And when we talk about the modern life and the modern world, we are talking about the secret of a lot of things in the Islamic tradition or in the world is the heart. Secret of love is the heart. Secret of knowing reality of how it is, seeing truth, seeing things for what they are, is also in the heart based on the Islamic tradition. And not just the organ, the whole metaphorical heart. And that's a separate discussion of its own. But the modern world, social media, modern life, it's made in a way that disconnects you from your heart. So remember to connect back with your heart, because you will start seeing a reality in a very different version when you're connected with yourself. And modern world has every single thing, from social media to your Instagram, to your threads, to your any other account, which actually would make you disconnected from your own heart. So the more you're connected with your values, your principles, your own heart, the better it is. Ibn Ata'Allah Iskandari, he was a great scholar, and he says that heart is more like a tree, which needs to be watered. And what is the water? It's the obedience of God. So when you do things from that perspective, you will bear the fruits. But when you are not obedient, or you don't water the heart, you don't replenish it, the fruits start falling down, which means you don't realize the goodness of life when there is disobedience involved. So remember that the heart is the tree, and every tree needs water, and that water is the obedience. And if the water is not there, the fruits, the blessings of life that you have, they're going to fall, which means you cannot count your blessings. So being grateful is very important. So yeah, that was the idea. So what I wanted to talk about is not just the smaller things which we can do to foster our mental health, but also the challenges that we have as Muslims in the Muslim world when it comes to mental health. So I hope that some parts of what were discussed were beneficial to you. I hope so, at least. And thank you so much. And if now anybody has any questions, so definitely we can do that. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yaqeen. Do you have any question? Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I have two questions, actually. You mentioned the concept of revisiting the overarching understanding of therapy in the world through an Islamic lens, and it was CIP, the acronym for it. So I was wondering, do you feel that, and I've seen, it's not the first time that I've been exposed to this idea, but I wanted to confirm with you if you knew about the trajectory of this thought. Is this something that you feel is going to become big in the future? Are there any political or social challenges for Islamic-oriented therapy to become big and substantial in addressing the problems that you brought up in this lecture?
And the other question?
That was the second one. I just thought.
So your question is about when we talk about traditional Islamically oriented psychotherapy or psychotherapy in general. So what is the trajectory there, and is it something which is going to be big, right? I'll tell you something. What was the dominant school of thought before CBT? CBT is like the religion, cognitive behavioral therapy. You cannot, including our university, you have to train in CBT. You cannot be a modern therapist actually if you haven't trained in this modality in most part of the world, right? But how did it start? Started with Albert Ellis in the 60s, you have cognitive therapy. Then Aaron Beck comes in, makes some behavioral interventions. It started working. And people like, Pedesky and others, they just come in and there are different things and it develops. So the idea of Islamic psychotherapy in the modern times, like exploring those texts, translating them, and starting from the beginning, like how is the mechanism of change in the therapy? Because that is what you have to prove in order to make a therapy, what you call a scientific or empirical, is how do you make things work? How does change occur in a specific therapy? And that work is being done, and there are many publications. I mean, University of Michigan does it. There is a Journal of Islamic Psychotherapy. There are also, my thesis supervisor, Dr. Human Keshavarzi, he published a book from Routledge, which is very interesting about, the Islamic psychotherapy if we talk about it. But here's the idea, which might be interesting to a lot of you, is when we talk about which therapy works, right? We have different schools of thought. You have CBT, you have emotion-focused therapy, you have around 30 different modalities, you have existential therapy, etc. How do you know that this is evidence-based, right? We call as you have to practice evidence-based practice, EBP. And what is the evidence when we say that's scientific evidence? For example, how many of you are familiar with CBT? Those of you who study psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy. Anybody knows what it is? Like the basics of it, right? You know what the basics are. So you talk about maladaptive thoughts lead to maladaptive behavior. so change the thoughts because there are cognitive distortions, and that will lead to more adaptive behavior. That is the change mechanism, right? That's how CBT works. But the question is, this idea that there are maladaptive thoughts is actually an assumption. It's not proven. You made an assumption that there are maladaptive thoughts, they cause this, this, and this, and then the solution is that. But this very idea, the root of the idea that there are maladaptive thoughts, it's an assumption. There is nothing to be proven scientifically about it that there are maladaptive thoughts, right? So what am I trying to say here is, most of the modern therapy that you call as evidence-based therapy, it's based on outcome studies, not at the roots of the idea. So which would mean you will be like, how does it come into the Islamic idea? So the idea here when it comes to making the traditionally Islamically oriented psychotherapy to the standard of what modern therapies are, we don't actually have to go back and see like, you know what, do they believe in Islam or not? We just need outcome studies to say that it works. You know, when we talk about evidence-based practice, it looks like huge. They must have done a lot of different things and that's how it's scientific. It's not actually that complicated. So there is good future about it. There is a lot of work which is already happening in the field. There are actually training institutes, many different universities, Malaysia, Qatar, Turkey, offers education through many different centers when it comes to, you know, there are certifications, which is a 1-year certification in being certified as somebody who practices TIAP. So it looks good in terms of education and trajectory, but here is something why I got interested in it, because it had left a bad taste, right, when I left Malaysia and how things were done there because of what I discussed with you. But then when I met my thesis supervisor here, Dr. Human, and we talked about it in detail, I took the courses with him, and I remember some of the teachings which Professor Malik Badri had taught us, like back in the Malaysian days and even here. So it started, you know, somehow fitting in the places that we wanted to. So much so that a lot of the people that I see in therapy who are not practicing Muslims, but they would still want to have answers, or they would still want to have somebody who understands the culture and the religion they come from. And a lot of the parts of our culture are somehow rooted in the religion. So I don't think TIAP or Islamically oriented psychotherapy is only for people who are practicing religion. No, it's also for people who want to have solutions which are based on their culture, which is derived from the Islamic faith. So I hope that answers that, if that's what you were asking.
Thank you for your informative lecture. Thank you. My question is, you mentioned the collective trauma of Ummah. How do we approach this trauma practically? Is it like, as you mentioned, with society, to give to society, or one-to-one, or how is the best approach?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Collective trauma. When we talk about the collective trauma, for example, what I meant is that sometimes we try to look at the negative things which are happening in the Muslim world, right? You know, or people tell us that you don't have enough contributions in the Muslim world. But the idea is we go back to the history. Are they informed enough about the history and where we are coming from? Because mental health or these contributions, they are not just related to doing those things. They're also related to where you come from and the things that you have seen in your life. So the collective trauma of the Muslims, issue of the Palestine is there, and I talked about the other regions, but it's also the legacy of the colonialism. What colonialism did, what it took from us, and how we are on the receiving end of the discourse. So how does it change? I believe that education is a solution, but not just educating yourself for the sake of it, but making yourself proficient in knowing your history and identity. What is it that you believe in? Who am I, right? And that trauma, what we talked about, is also that we need to have practitioners. And by the way, when I say practitioners, it doesn't only mean mental health practitioner. It could be anybody. It could be a journalist. It could be somebody who is a writer. It could be a lawyer. But who know when you have a client which you are representing who is a Muslim, or who has a specific worldview and history, where that is exactly coming from. Because you will find a lot of answers which are actually in the history, which you cannot omit and which you cannot overlook because of just if you look at how the things are without looking at the background and the context of things. So I think that is very wide. And what also ended up happening during the colonial period is a lot of the legacy, a lot of the history, which was, a lot of it was saved, but a lot of it perished as well. And when you are at a receiving end, you are always trying to prove something. That, you know what, I'm very modern, I'm very scientific, I'm this and that. While as you don't always have to do that. You just have to believe in that you have a glorified tradition that we can go back to, where we can find a lot of principles which actually look very modern to us. But if we go back to a tradition, a lot of these issues have actually been addressed before. So that's what I meant by collective trauma. Our identity, where we come from, having empathy from one another, creating spaces, and having a group of intellectuals and people in different fields who know where the context and background is, where we're coming from. I hope that answers you.
Any question left?
Yes, please.
I want just to ask you about the intergenerational trauma and how can one overcome the guilt. It's not about the stigma, but more about like when you see and you acknowledge the pain of the parents and grandparents and how resilient and brave they were, how can one ask for help, and don't feel weak?
So your question is about intergenerational trauma. And is it the guilt which is caused by that, or it's a personal trauma that the guilt is because of that?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Right. So intergenerational trauma is more about the stories that we hear and how resilient, the older generations, like our fathers or grandfather generations were, and how do we feel in the face of that. I think the first idea, whenever we start, is acknowledging and validating that something like that happened. Right? It happened in reality. It's not just a construct with your mind made up somehow. And it will have its implications when it comes to your thinking, when it comes to your feelings, and when it comes to your behavior. A lot of the things which I realized based on intergenerational trauma, which I had seen in Kashmir, was when I did my own self-therapy. To be a therapist, there is certain hours of self-therapy in certain schools of thought that you have to do. Then I realized how much of it was there. Our parents will stop us, let's say, don't go outside after this specific hour, right? And we're like, why is that? Or the fear which was always there. Or, small things. You have collection of those dried vegetables and rice which can last for 1 year. Because you never know if it's going to be tomorrow, it's going to be a crackdown, and then you have these supplies for such a long period of time. At that time, I didn't understand why it was. I thought it's just a part of the culture. Everybody does this. But when you start realizing that, so I think it starts with acknowledging. But then there is also the idea of an acknowledgement from the people who wronged you. And that doesn't always come, you see? Because somebody who wronged you, how do you get a sense of closure? When they accept that, I'm really sorry, what we did to you was wrong. And as nations don't accept that. Israel doesn't get up and say that, I'm sorry what we did to the Palestinians, right? It doesn't work like that. So how do you provide yourself that sense of closure is something very essential. So more than, you talked about the guilt, the idea is, where is that coming from? Is it coming from the idea that our parents, they were stronger than us, or they did more than what we are trying to do or trying to achieve? So I think guilt that you talked about can be from many different sources. But the idea here is acknowledgement that it happened, and then what comes next. It's about stories of pain, because there is suffering in the world, but there is also healing. And even though there is trauma, but there is also resilience. There are both ends of, so if we come from a place of trauma, right? And how do we turn that into resilience? And the idea to do that would be, where the trauma is coming from, what the source is, and you look for what is the best course of action, right? Imagine this. World has only used nuclear powers once, right? And America bombed Japan. They still don't acknowledge it was something wrong which they did, right? They don't acknowledge it. But what did Japan do? Imagine destruction after a nuclear war. They focused on science, they focused on technology. Most of the modern chips, which Intel used to make, they were patented in Japan. Japanese cars, for example, they're all over in the US, right? So they used more of an intellectual approach to get back, to rise, to be resilient, even though whatever was done to us. So I think our past does affect us in terms of trauma, but it really doesn't define us, because we are not prisoners of past. We can be architects of our future, right? So even though things happened to us, it was not our fault. I mean, what my parents went through, or what our parents went through in the Muslim world, or because of the oppression, it wasn't their fault. But how do we address that? How do we take responsibility for our healing? That is a little bit on us. So I think it needs to be checked on the both sides. And ultimately, human beings are curious creatures. We always want to create meaning, right? So the trauma your parents went through, the sacrifices that they did, or everything else, what does it mean to you? What meaning does it provide to your life? Because ultimately, if we have meaningful activities, memories, things we do, they give us personal meaning of satisfaction, or whatever meaning means to you. I think that is something which is very essential, to ask ourselves, to write our narrative in a way that, what do these things mean to me? How does it affect me as an individual? To recognize those things. And where do I go from there? What is my vision, right? If I'm here, and because of what happened in my past, am I going to let it define who I am? Or there are things which can be built. And this is, by the way, in trauma therapy, we do this. For instance, in narrative therapy, how you have a narrative, right, that you're talking about, where it comes from. But how can you build on top of that in order to achieve and excel and thrive in life? Okay? Yes.
So I remember asking therapist who was like, I think 35 years old or something, he was my friend, about the approach he's using with people who are not religious and people who are religious.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that there are two separate ways. Like people think that, and he was like telling me that, having this, when you said at the beginning, like you're depressed because you don't pray or something like that, this is wrong, and you have to choose the right approach. But and I also remember one thing when I went to Germany for an Erasmus semester, and I asked a friend of mine there about when he went to therapy once, and he was like, he's a religious, and he's a Muslim, of course, and he told me like, therapist told him like cliche things that didn't really help him. And I was wondering, sorry, I was wondering about how the approach is different, and the thing you said about having an Islamic-oriented therapy could be like the key or something like that. I don't have something like in mind to order, but if it really, like, is it really different, the approach, or is it because, like, if the person is religious, so a different approach would be like better for him?
Right.
Sorry, the question is very...
No, I can understand it. You see, here's the idea. When it comes to Islamically oriented psychotherapy, it's also something which comes from the point of non-judgment. So for example, it's not, let's say for example, if a person is non-religious, or a person has depression and a person is not religious, so you'll tell them start praying, you'll start getting okay. That's not what it is. It's a proper therapy. But the idea where it differs is this. In Western psychology, and what you're trying to tell me, what happened in Germany, it happened in Germany as well when I was there. I was living there for a while, and it also happens to many of the clients that I see in private practice who are from the eastern part of the world, but they are living in the Western world. Example, child has problem of alcoholism or drug addiction and other things, but they're adults, let's say, young adults. And they go to the therapist, they'll be like, or they're having boyfriends or girlfriends or live in relationships. They go to the therapist says, you're an adult, you're responsible for your own choices, leave your parents if it's your life, it's your choice, do whatever. And the parents are like, it actually became more destructive. Like, going to the therapy, the outcomes were actually worse than what we were expecting. How can something like that happen? So you see, the idea is whoever the therapist is, they would have to understand if a client is acting in a certain way or comes from a certain background, how much is it acknowledged? And in the Western psychotherapy or in that perspective, it's extremely difficult. And why is that? It's very individualistic. Here's the idea. I have had people I have seen who are Western people, like, in therapy, let's say. You tell them their problems are because of this, this, and that, and they follow it, it's okay, right? In the Muslim world, we're very collectivist, like I said. And a lot of the trauma sometimes comes from the families, but you see them once a week in therapy, they go back to the same family, and there are the same factors, it actually starts getting worse, right? So we need different intervention methods than what works for in individual psychotherapy, in individual Western psychotherapy, right? So when I do individual psychotherapy, let's say, with clients from, let's say, Kashmir, they're living somewhere else, at some point, I definitely have to involve their parents one way or the other, even though it's very individualistic, but a lot of the trauma that they have is actually coming from the families, or it's a lot of unfinished business with the families, or with somebody close in the family from which the abuse happened, or the trauma happened, or they are not listening to them. So the idea is this. Either way, if you're seeing a therapist, you have to see somebody who understands your culture. And if that culture happens to be Muslim, very well. But even traditional Islamic psychotherapy is, for example, let's say I am, doing TIAP. But if I see a client who says, I want to have my answers from that perspective, then only you talk about it. Because you cannot impose your own values upon somebody else. Because just because I'm a Muslim or I believe in a worldview, doesn't mean the client I have would have same thing. Maybe the person is an atheist. Maybe the person doesn't believe in a God or doesn't believe in Islam, belongs to a different religion. Then you wouldn't do Islamic therapy with them, of course. So when the person says, I want to have my answers because I'm a Muslim, I want to have answers from an Islamic, or in interventions which are based in religion, or you tell them, this is your issue, would you like to explore it from the perspective of Islam? If they say yes, and then you'll be like, okay, that's fine. But either way, in whatever therapy it is, therapists cannot impose their own values upon the clients. That's not how it works. I hope that answers your question.
I have a small follow-up question. The therapy that we have in the Muslim countries, is it like, I think it's all with the Western
Yes.
criteria, right?
Correct.
So therefore we need to have a new system. That's what you're saying.
What I was trying to say is yes, we need to do that. But if we already have, if there are proper ethics followed, if people are doing Western psychotherapy and people are getting better, let's say you go to a therapist, who's not doing Islamic psychotherapy, who's doing a normal therapy, understands your culture, validates it, you're doing well, you're getting better, that's already good, that's fine. But if you have a person, it could also be somebody is, doing Islamic psychotherapy and you start getting worse and the person judges you and does other things which are not allowed to do in therapy, right? It goes both ways. So the idea is following proper ethical code, right? Because don't think somebody just says, religious therapy, that should be good. There is religious abuse as well. So it goes both ways. So the idea is following the ethics and somebody who knows your culture and knows your religion, who's well informed in that. So many of the interventions, they can actually be Western, but they can still be helpful. While as we do need people, the idea was who acknowledge where we come from. So yeah.
Much needed. So I want to know, what is Islamic psychology from your perspective? Because I've been hearing about Islamic psychology a lot, and I want to understand, how do you see Western or non-Islamic psychological theories, for example, cognition,
Right.
that the theory that fall into cognitive psychology, how would these fit into Islamic psychology?
Right.
Do they fit in, or do we have to come up with our own things?
Right. Answering that question, there are interventions, for example, which technically fit in, like, when it comes to cognition, when it comes to certain things of CBT, they're also applied in TIAP. But it's more of an emotion-focused approach. Like I said, religion is more to appeal to the emotions, right? So generally what you do is you have a case formulation, right? You try to do the case formulation more in terms of seeing where is the level of tawakkul in this person, right? How much religiosity is in and there are scales for that, by the way. You do that. And then you see where is the point of inkishaf, or how does the person has this insights into themselves, right? Because the basic principles of therapy, mental status examination, others, it follows the same thing, but only the mechanism of change has differences there, because ultimately the aim in TIP would be in order to make a person realize who they are so that they're closer to God. That's the major difference. But are there interventions which are based on CBT and EFT, which are done in traditional Islamically oriented psychotherapy? Yes. Example, exposure. People with religious OCD, right? There are a lot of Muslims, let's say they take many hours in making the wudu, they repeat their prayers many times, right? So what do? Exposure. And exposure is recognized in CBT. You do the same things, but you do cognitive restructuring based on Islamic texts, right? So for instance, Prophet ﷺ said that the wudu only breaks if you're certain about it, right? So has this happened to you where you said no? So that means you are in a state of wudu. Then can you deny? So example like that. So that works more with the person, let's say with Islamic religious OCD. A Western approach wouldn't work there of just exposure, right? So exposure to what? So that would be which is why you would often see this. People, especially with religious OCD, it gets untreated. Because even though they try to see a therapist, they try to approach it from a very general perspective. So if this cognitive restructuring is not based on the Islamic principles, they wouldn't get it. Yeah? Similarly, you have Gestalt therapy or emotion-focused therapy where you do two-chair, unfinished business, right? Either you are criticizing yourself, what you call as critic work, 2 chairs, right? Or unfinished business with the person that you cannot address directly or who has passed away already. So in TIP, we do that as well. Why? Because it leads to the bigger picture, right? In terms of clarity. So yeah, it does recognize things which are beneficial, right? But in other words, the foundation, case formulation, and mechanisms of change, they are more based on the Islamic literature rather than the change mechanisms of CBT or EFT. So yeah, that's the principal difference, if that answers you.
Thank you so much for this inspiring session.